everyone. Welcome to Resistance Live for the 5th of June, 2025. I hope you all are doing okay today. It's a really kind of interesting day on the legal front. Some of you are not going to like all the comments I have to make today. I can tell you that already, but you come here for the legal analysis to some extent. And I don't know, man, there's a case right now that everybody's very, very outraged about on social media. And I get why people are outraged by this decision by the Supreme Court. But at the same time, if you don't understand the nuance of the law behind it, you might not understand exactly why it is that the ruling went down the way that it did. So we're going to talk about all of this. And we also have to talk about the biggest breaking legal news of the last 24 hours, which is a like complete bombshell order from Judge Boasberg concerning people who are detained at CCOT. So more on that in a minute. Today, for our visually challenged viewers, I am wearing a lilac colored V-neck top. My hair is pulled back. I'm a pink-skinned, green-eyed, dirty, blonde-haired woman. I'm in front of my bookshelf and my yellow utility cart in my office. As always, I'm coming to you from occupied Muncie, Lenape, and Mohican land. Okay, so yesterday afternoon, we had a very significant ruling from Judge Boasberg in the case involving the people who were extraordinarily rendered to CCOT in El Salvador. There's two very significant things about this case, this ruling rather. The first is that he granted class certification status. Those of you who have been here for a really long time know that I started my legal career as a class action lawyer. I've walked you all through multiple times here how Rule 23 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure governs how classes are certified. We did a deep dive on this like just a month ago. So one of the things that I want people to be aware of here is that certifying a class isn't always easy, and it's definitely not a foregone conclusion because of the requirements of what's called commonality and predominance, meaning that you have to show that there are common injuries and common facts to every single person in the class. And you also have to show that those common facts predominate over individual ones. With regard to the people detained in CCOT, this one is an easy call because they all were extraordinarily rendered without due process to this detention camp / slave labor facility in El Salvador at the whim of the Trump administration under the Alien Enemies Act, which is, by the way, the Supreme Court has since ruled they can't do. Okay. So the first thing that was very significant about this decision was that Judge Boasberg granted class certification. And that means now that everyone at CCOT is within the class, meaning that even though there's only a few named plaintiffs in front of Judge Boasberg in this case, they represent all the people who were extraordinarily rendered to CCOT under the AEA. This is very significant because it means the relief that is applied to the class applies to everyone. All right. So that thing is very significant. That's one very significant part of it. But the second really significant part of it was that the judge ordered the Trump administration to respond in 1 week as to how they were going to provide due process to every single person detained at CCOT so that they could file habeas corpus petitions, meaning petitions that would require their release. Okay. This, by the way, is grounded in Supreme Court authority now because the Supreme Court ruled that everyone who was potentially subject to the same executive order was entitled to due process and habeas relief. Okay, they at least have a right to pursue habeas corpus in a court of law prior to being removed. All right, so the Supreme Court is behind this ruling that Judge Boasberg issued yesterday. And the real question now that's hanging out there is what the Trump administration is going to do with this. Because I have to remind you all, as we talked about yesterday, there's now not one, not two, but 3 separate judges lining up to hold the Trump administration in contempt for various things they've done with regard to immigration policy. This instance is very significant because it could end up with an order requiring the Trump administration to return every single person who's at CCOT to the United States so they have the capacity to receive due process. We're not there yet, but it's one of those potential things that is hanging out there in the very near future. Again, the Trump administration has 1 week to respond to this. There are various ways in which we have a little bit of kind of speculative precedent that may apply to this, because you all will remember that there was this plane that left the United States and landed in Djibouti that was destined for a country in South Africa in the midst of a civil war, South Sudan, that had 6 people on it that were not from that country. And a couple of weeks ago, we had an order from another judge mandating that every single person on that plane was entitled to due process, and that the United States was not allowed to release any of those people, meaning the Trump administration, was not allowed to release those people from its custody absent due process. And that plane eventually returned. One of the things that I want people to remember here is that due process can technically be applied when you're like out of the country, as long as you were given an opportunity to file a claim and consult with legal counsel. How the United States government is going to provide access to legal counsel and due process to the 230 plus people who were detained in CCOT is a really big question. And I will just tell you that Judge Boasberg's order yesterday, if you haven't read it, I'm just going to let you all know that it is not just a scathing order in its own right. It's actually really erudite in the way that it's written. It opens with a story from, with a summary essentially of Franz Kafka's story called The Trial, which is essentially where the police show up at someone's home and they tell the person that they're being detained. And the person says, "Why am I being detained?" And they won't answer. The person says, "Where am I being taken?" And they won't answer. "We're not authorized to tell you that." And on it goes. And this is originally a surrealist story. And Franz Kafka, you all know, wrote the whole story about a man who turns into a bug. This was originally a surrealist story, but Judge Boasberg opened his order summarizing this particular story by Franz Kafka by saying, like, that moment is now. This is what you did to these men who were not told where they were going, who were not given an opportunity to contest it, who weren't told why they were being detained. And Judge Boasberg notes that we now know, unlike when this particular case started, that the vast majority of the people at CCOT are being detained, and I'm just going to quote the exact language here, are being detained on flimsy, even frivolous, that's the phrase, flimsy, even frivolous allegations, meaning that there's literally no legal reason that they should have been rendered to a concentration camp. Not that anybody deserves that. Please don't mistake me. But there's not any argument that they are even like accused of a crime or that they weren't entitled to due process inside the United States for any reason. So this opinion is a very strongly worded opinion. That it may not seem that way to lay people, but to lawyers reading that, when I read it, I was like, wow, like he's done, like not just like mildly done, like done. I will tell you, it is extremely rare for judges, especially on the federal bench, to start out an order like this by comparing what's happening to a surrealist tale of an authoritarian state. And then on top of it, to say that the vast majority of the people at CCOT are there on flimsy, even frivolous allegations, tells us where this is headed. So when this opinion dropped yesterday and various folks, including Allison Gill and myself, were commenting about this, there were people who were like, none of this matters. And I'm just going to say something because I think this is really important. I know it's very easy. We've talked about this here before, but I know it's really easy for people to get very cynical and bitter in this era, to get to a place of like, nothing matters at all. And I'm going to tell you that this actually really matters a lot. Because not only is Judge Boasberg backed up by the Supreme Court in this ruling, the Supreme Court's rulings as such are cited in the first 2 pages of his order. In addition to that, he has essentially said every single person who you unlawfully detained and sent there has to be provided with due process. And you are going to tell me how to do it or face the sanctions of the court. So I take this as very good news. And as always, I want folks to take the good news where they can find it. I know everybody's out there saying at the moment Trump is just defying court orders. I am going to tell you again, and this is the problem with the way anybody getting their news off of mainstream media or standard social media is receiving information right now, because people are not getting the amplified information about how a number of cases are like right up on the verge of holding people in contempt. They're not getting the amplified information about even this case. One thing that was shocking to me about this particular decision is that in my feed, which is like all politics and law, nobody mentioned this for the first 3 hours after the case dropped. And that says something. Like, it's not even front page news on the New York Times this morning. And so one of the things that I think people need to consider here is that just because something is not being amplified by mainstream media doesn't mean it's not really significant. And again, this has got to be a part of your media literacy in this era, not everything that really matters, like, protests, positive court decisions, determinations that result in a rollback of negative policies by Trump, which, by the way, is happening every day. Like, we hear about all these terrible EOs and then nobody talks about the fact that they changed their minds on this stuff. All of that stuff is extremely significant, because one of the things that people like Anat Shankar-Osorio and others talk about quite a bit is the fact that the way that you defeat fascism is by chipping away at the pillars that hold it up. And anything that happens in the law, in the streets, in your own local community, in the criminal justice system generally, in terms of people being released who are unlawfully detained, every single thing in that direction starts to move the needle. And it also, by the way, is leading to what we've been talking about so many times already this week, of whole communities rising up against ICE because they're outraged about their own community members being detained and deported. So things are moving in a positive direction at least some of the time, and it's very important that we keep our eyes on that. All right, so very good news out of Boasberg's courtroom, and we'll see where we are in a week. I'm watching this one very closely. Okay, let's talk for a second about the 3 Supreme Court decisions that came down this morning. 2 of them were unanimous, and 1 of them only had Ketanji Brown Jackson as a dissent. The one that everybody's really upset about this morning is a case out of Ohio where a straight woman argued that she had been discriminated against because she had been passed over for promotion 2 times, and the 2 people who actually got the promotion were gay. She changed her story on this in the appeals court, claiming that, she had straight supervisors, and then she claimed in the appeals court that there was 1 gay supervisor who had been involved in the decision. And essentially, the thing you need to understand about the groundwork for this case, which makes it much easier to understand why the court went this way, is that the legal issue that was at stake was whether or not there was a heightened standard on people who are of a majority to prove that they have been discriminated against, or whether everybody has the same standard to prove discrimination. Okay, so there's a bit of a misunderstanding. This is the part that I said I thought a lot of you weren't going to like, but I'm trying to explain it in a way so that you can understand why all 9 Supreme Court justices ruled this way and why Ketanji Brown Jackson wrote the opinion. She is the person who wrote the opinion in this case. The thing that people need to understand is that the basis of the decision was about what standard applies in the lower courts to determine whether or not discrimination has taken place. This does not say that every single straight person is going to have a case against an employer in the event that a gay person is promoted instead. That's not what this case says. And, there are people running around on social media this morning saying things like, every single straight person is now going to sue their employer if they don't get promoted, and they're going to claim reverse discrimination. They're going to have a basis to do it. False. That is not what this case says. All this case says is that every person alleging discrimination is subject to the same legal standard, meaning that if you're gay or you're straight, you're black or you're white, you're Muslim or you're Christian, you have the same burden of proof to determine whether or not you have been discriminated against. That's it. Okay. Now, I don't love the fact that this case went down the way that it went down, because it is going to be amplified by the far right-wing media as straight people's rights, right? We can't change the kind of way in which the disinformation networks and the propagandist networks are going to spin this, okay? But it does not, I want to make this really clear, it does not give straight people any more rights than gay people. In fact, it does exactly the opposite. It says everybody's on a level playing field in terms of your burden of proof, okay? And, from that standard, I get why the court went the way that it went, right? Because the thing that strikes me as particularly dangerous in all of this is the idea that there would be a heightened burden of proof for some and a lower burden of proof for others. And what do you do when someone is of an intersectional identity? Let's say they're disabled, but they're straight. Okay. Let's say that they are of a racial minority, but they're, I don't know, an Ivy League graduate, right? There's intersectional ways in which these things play out all the time. And so putting everybody on an even playing field in terms of the standard that is to be applied makes an awful lot of sense if you think about it. All right. So again, I don't love it from a messaging standpoint, but I get it from a legal one. So I hope that's really clear to everybody, because it's very important to understand that, you know, social media thrives on outrage. There's a lot of people talking about this case as if it is, you know, outrageous, when in fact it's literally just about what does a person have to prove in court to prove that they were discriminated against. That's literally all this case is about. The fact that it's like a straight woman suing because she's a bigot doesn't really matter in the context of like, what's the legal standard to be applied. I hope that all makes sense. I'm doing my best to explain it as much as possible in layperson's language. Okay. The second case that came out this morning was a case where Mexico sued United States gun manufacturers because they claimed that U.S. gun manufacturers had contributed to gang violence in Mexico by creating this like easy supply chain for guns. And there is a passed piece of legislation inside the United States, which many of you are familiar with, which says that gun manufacturers cannot be held liable for gun violence. You know, this is on my list, by the way, of in my fantasy world of what happens when progressives take over the government at long last. One of the things that legislation will take care of in fast order, okay? Because there's literally no reason for gun manufacturers not to be held liable for violence that is perpetrated with their products. Just like if you're a pharmaceutical manufacturer and you create a faulty device that is used to kill people, you can get sued inside the United States. Okay. Shouldn't be any different for gun manufacturers. So one of the things that this case said was, because Mexico said all of the harm that happened as a result of these gun manufacturers was extraterritorial to the United States. It happened in Mexico. And the Supreme Court said, nope, this law applies to everyone. And we're not going to let you sue in U.S. courts. We're not going to let you sue gun manufacturers in U.S. courts, because, you know, there's jurisdiction over them because they're located here, just because you're Mexico. Not an ideal decision, but also not shocking in light of where the court generally tends to lie on Second Amendment stuff. Okay. The last decision is a decision that kind of arguably plays in line with religious and church tax exemptions. And again, this is a case where I understand why the Supreme Court came down the way that it did. Essentially, there was a Catholic charity that was doing a lot of work that was considered like secular, right? It wasn't explicitly, even though, I mean, and this is the moment where I just kind of like lose my mind over this, because I'm, you know, I have my moments about like, this is another conversation. I'm about to go off on a tangent, but you know, like, about the way in which Christianity is interpreted by the far right. Okay. But they were doing all this work with people who were unhoused and providing all these services that arguably were not in furtherance of Catholic Church's mission. And they were denied a tax exemption as, you know, a church-based entity, even though they're a Catholic charity, as a result. Okay. And the Supreme Court ruled that, in fact, they are entitled to that tax exemption. And I'm not surprised by this either, because, you know, by the way, like nonprofits get tax exemptions for doing similar kinds of work. So again, I have to remind you all that like many Catholic charities under the umbrella of Catholic charities do incredible work, and the tax exempt status allows them to do more of it. Okay, so this is actually like not a terrible decision. Now, I will remind you all that we've had a number of oral arguments so far this term on issues of religious freedom and liberty. We had that decision that was a plurality decision 4-4 a couple of weeks ago. Amy Coney Barrett recused because of her relationship with Notre Dame, the university, that essentially allowed Ohio to keep money, charter school money, out of religious schools, which was a really good decision because it kept the separation of church and state in place. There's another decision that we're waiting on this term. I'm going to remind you all, like I said yesterday, one of the things that I have to remind everyone of is that we are in the height now. It's June. We're in the height of Supreme Court decision territory. So there are multiple, many, like we're going to be here doing this like at least twice a week, cases yet to be decided by the Supreme Court between now and the end of the term, which is usually at the end of June. Sometimes it bleeds over into the first few days of July. So all of this is significant, but I did want to make it really clear to everyone why the most like scandalous decision of the morning came out the way that it did. And I have to say, again, this is not a case. I want to make this really clear. It's not a case where any straight person can say, a gay person got promoted anyway, I've been discriminated against. It simply says the burden, the standard applied in the court of law is the same for everybody. That's it. Okay. We had some very bad news yesterday, which is that there is a renewed travel ban. this one, I saw this last night when I was laying in bed, and I was just thinking about the fact, you all know that the way this broadcast started, by the way, was on the 27th of January of 2017, a week after Trump took office the first time, from in front of the federal courthouse in Brooklyn, where the ACLU was seeking a ban of the travel ban. And that was after everybody had been at JFK and had moved, over to Brooklyn, where the case was being heard. And there were literally 1,000 people in the streets in the freezing cold, in the dark, including me. This travel ban is worse than the first one. And I was laying in bed last night thinking, how much things have changed in 8 years, right? About the tolerance for this kind of absolutely xenophobic bigotry from a presidential administration. So this one is against 12 countries, and it essentially stops the issuing of any visas for anyone seeking to come in from those countries. And it includes Venezuela, which of course is one of Trump's most hated nations. And it includes a number of African countries, and it includes a couple of countries in the Middle East. All that said, we have presidential authority, including from all the way back in 2017, of why these travel bans are unconstitutional. And so one of the things that I just want people to remember is that, again, there will be lawsuits filed on this. My bet would be the ACLU has a lawsuit ready to go as soon as today. And so we're going to have to move through the courts again in its own, in its own progress timeline. But this will not go unchallenged. Okay. And I have to just tell you all that this is in conjunction with new interventions by the Trump administration into the ability of foreign students to study at Harvard and Columbia. Again, I'm going to remind everybody, just because we're talking about Columbia, if you play ball with bullies, they will come back and bully you more. Because Columbia bent the knee, and now here we are again. And they're also moving to eliminate Columbia's accredited status as a university, because Trump is so mad, or rather, I should say, President Stephen Miller is so mad that they're not allowing the intervention by the administration into the way that they teach and hire and everything else. So those are hanging out there. And again, I think we're going to see a lot of movement on this in the courts. Okay. Now I know the courts are slow for everybody, but we have an absolute ability, the ACLU and other organizations and individuals have the absolute ability to challenge these things in court, and that's coming. And yes, I should have mentioned this. The travel ban takes effect on Monday. It is not effective now. The EO was signed last night, but it takes effect on Monday. Okay, someone on the Patreon feed, reminder, if you want to ask me questions, you can become a paid subscriber for as little as $5 a month. You get to ask me questions 3 hours before every broadcast, and I will answer them on writing or in the air, on the air, not in the air, in writing or on the air. Someone asked me a question about the new merit-based hiring plan that was issued by Russ Vought and the Office of Management and Budget. So speaking of reverse discrimination, many of you will remember that Trump issued an executive order not all that long ago saying that he was eliminating any quotas, not that there were, quotas in hiring in the federal government on the basis of any protected category. Okay, so this merit-based hiring plan speaks the language of non-discrimination, right? It says things like, no one can be discriminated against on the basis of race, sex, religion, national origin, all those sorts of things, like very classic EEO language. But what they're actually talking about is giving themselves permission to hire way more white people. And it's in there in very coded language, but that's essentially what it says. The other thing that this merit-based hiring plan seeks to do is shorten the window of time for hiring into federal positions. So essentially, and there's an example of this morning, unfortunately. Oh my God, you guys, again, sometimes I just have to laugh as a coping mechanism because it's so bad. So this morning there was an announcement that a 22-year-old former campaign staffer has now been hired as the deputy chief of a counterterrorism unit inside DHS. He's 22. His government photo is of him with one raised eyebrow, Joey from Friends, how you doing? That's exactly what it looks like. And this is a white guy with no experience, no qualifications, and all of this coded propaganda. And here's like, we're hiring based on merit, right? All of it is propagandist language. And there's language in there that says like, we're not going to hire from Ivy League schools anymore. We're going to hire from like community organizations and, various other, trade schools and stuff. And essentially what they're doing is they're taking all the guardrails off the traditional policies that, that allowed for the federal government to be like one of the most diverse workforces anywhere. And now they're like reducing it all down to like Doge guys who smoke a ton of weed. That's basically like where this plan is headed. So I want people to just be really, really mindful that one of the things, and I think we're a lot smarter about this now than we were like 8 years ago or 9 years ago. One of the things that I want people to be aware of is that like they're using the coded language that previously was applied, by liberals and the left in trying to create equitable workforces. But what they're using it for is actually to eliminate policies that led to greater diversity and equity. And so that's what that is all about. And I just am going to tell you all that I also think that there's a basis to challenge this in court. I'm certain that there's going to be, arguments to be made that the hiring practices are discriminatory against people who are of minority status. And we'll have to see what comes of that next. Okay. Okay. Little regional discussion here. I voted yesterday, by the way. It's New Jerseyites. I know we have a bunch of people from New Jersey here. Please vote. Early voting is open in the gubernatorial primary and for state elections. I voted yesterday for Ross Baraka, who we all know was arrested by the Trump administration, is now suing the Trump administration for trying to exercise his duty at the Delaney Detention ICE facility in Newark, New Jersey. Voted for him yesterday. So New Jerseyites, please get out there and vote. But lots of big doings in New York City that are telling a tale for the greater part of the country. And so we're going to talk about this for a second. Last night, there was a mayoral debate for New York City candidates for mayor. Included on that platform are a lot of very qualified people and Andrew Cuomo. Andrew Cuomo, I have to say it again, New Yorkers, do not rank him. Do not even rank him on your ballot. Do not put his name anywhere near your ballot. Do not check the box. If you rank him, there's a possibility that he will be elected. Performed he sounds like a dinosaur. He's clearly very Trumpian in the way that he operates. I'm going to remind you he was accused of sexual harassment by 13 different former female staffers. And that's leaving aside all the people who died in nursing homes during COVID while he was out there grandstanding with his press conferences during the day and then routing people with COVID into nursing homes so that nursing home residents died at a much higher rate than they would have otherwise. Last night there was a debate, and lo and behold, my fave, Zohran Mamdani, kicked some serious ass in the mayoral debate. He is young. He is a Muslim. He is an immigrant. He is progressive. He is endorsed by the Working Families Party. And as of this morning, watch this space, he is endorsed by AOC to be the next mayor of New York. Reminder, of course, her district is in New York City. What is shaping up to be the case here is that this is going to be a mayoral race between Cuomo, old dog, allegedly Democrat, lots of corruption and scandal, very Trumpian in the way that he operates, clear narcissist, and Zohran Mamdani, young, Muslim, person of color, obviously, immigrant, deeply progressive. Talked about this yesterday, how he wants to freeze the rent rates in all of New York City and many, many other things. And he's a genius. Like, if you have not seen him speak, you should go follow him today on Blue Sky, because he's also doing just these incredible marketing videos that are designed to really, they're very short, they're very pithy. And also a number of the other mayoral candidates are working together to make sure that Cuomo doesn't win. Like, they've been very strategically smart about this. So you should go check him out, because honestly, I'm very inspired by him right now. Now, granted, I live right outside of New York City, so this is all very relevant to me. But on top of it, I think this is going to be a watershed kind of election moment. And, the primary for the Democratic Party, which is kind of all that matters in the New York City mayoral race. I mean, not everything. There have been Republicans elected historically, but this one's really big, is starting like very soon. In fact, we're going to have I can't remember when the exact election day is, but I think early voting opens today. And so I think we're going to have a determination on this one. I believe it's by the 14th of June. I may be wrong on that date. Don't quote me on it. But one of the things that I just want people to be aware of is that if Mamdani pulls this off, it truly pulls this off. And I know everybody's got this idea that New York City is also blue and liberal. It also is the home of Wall Street. And you'd be shocked by how many people in New York City actually are kind of conservative. If Mamdani pulls this off, it's going to be a real watershed moment of political prediction. And I am like eyes on this nonstop between now and when the election is called. So you should check him out, like seriously check him out. And it, again, even if you're not terribly invested in New York City politics, this is one to watch, because if he takes down Cuomo and he becomes the first identified socialist mayor of New York City, it's going to kind of change the game for the Democratic Party a little bit. And if not the Democratic Party, at least for Working Families Party, because they've endorsed the guy and their slate is right. By the way, Ross Barack is also their candidate for governor in New Jersey. So really interesting times, really interesting times. And he's very inspiring. Seriously, go watch him speak. Okay. Last reminder for today, June 14th, coming up very soon, is the No Kings Day protest. Also the same day that Trump's having all of his military parade in Washington, D.C. for his birthday. Please go to the indivisible.org site and get involved with a protest near you. There's literally 7 in the surrounding area of where I live. And I'm going to have to decide which one to go to, because it's also the same day as our huge Pride Festival. We're probably going to try to hit both. And so please make sure that you are signed up to attend one. They're all over the country. And it's another good day for mass mobilization, for getting people together, for showing that we stand together. And I'll say one other thing about this. There's been a lot of discussion on the various Substacks in the last couple of days about does big protest work? And you all have heard me say that the messaging of big protest really matters right now. What is the ask? What is the purpose? But people standing together for a common role at a significant moment, which this is, also shows people that they're not alone. And that in and of itself at this moment is really important, as long as it's not the only thing that you're doing. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here in our audience, but please make sure that you are deeply invested in working alongside local organizations where you live, because the community-based organizing work that we're doing is actually the thing that's going to keep people alive. And it's really important to not just show up at a protest and then do nothing else. Okay. So stay invested in what's happening locally, and let's build power for the long term. Okay. Critical stuff. All right. Please like this broadcast if you haven't already. I will remind you all also that we have a free downloadable guide that is going to be linked in the comments and is already linked below in the show notes about how to lead right now, how to lead change right now without burning out. You can go check that out. Also, reminder to all of you, we are hosting a webinar a week from Monday on the topic of stealth activism. It's free. It's going to be at 1 p.m. on Monday, June 16th. I will make sure that I have that linked up here when I'm done. And also, I will drop the link to register for that into the comments as well. Hope to see as many of you there as possible, because we're going to be talking about how you can make a difference even if you're not in the front line of a protest. Very, very important to do that. All right. I will see all of you here tomorrow live. Our Patreon subscribers will also we will also be having a progressive coffee hour tomorrow afternoon at 3 p.m. Eastern, noon Pacific. So if you're not yet a Patreon subscriber, you can head over there and hop on that. And otherwise, I will catch you back here tomorrow live at regular time. All right, everybody, have a good Thursday. Lots of love, everybody. Bye.